A very warm welcome, everyone, to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name's Barry Sadler, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about container ship fires. Many of you will have seen in the news that we have yet another container ship that is well ablaze in the Indian Ocean. The Wanhai 503 developed a fire on board on June the 10th, and despite the best efforts of the crew, the fire is raging out of control. Ship is currently 130 miles northwest of Kochi in India, and therefore the majority of the response to the emergency is being conducted by the Indian Coast Guard. They have several vessels in attendance, two of which are continuously firefighting the container fires, which are now raging pretty much in every single hold on board the ship. The necessity to use large amounts of water to try and control the fire, to minimise the possibility that the ship will be lost, and therefore minimise any further environmental damage to happen in that part of the world, means that the water is affecting the vessel's stability. The vessel has developed a list, and that list is increasing. And although salvors are confident of being able to tow the vessel into port, there are some limitations as to how quickly they can get to the fire on board the ship to bring it fully under control, to preserve the environment, and of course start to recover some of the property from on board the ship. Obviously, it's going to take a long time for the investigators to discover exactly what caused the start of this latest container ship fire and put out a notice as to how it can perhaps be prevented in the future. But let's have a look at some of the reasons why, over the past decade to 15 years, the number of container ship fires has increased. Not just increased in frequency, but increased in severity to the point where many P&I clubs are starting to get incredibly concerned as to this very worrying trend. Let's give you a few names of ships to start with, just to give you an idea of the scale of some of these fires that are burning. The MSC Flaminia, which happened in 2012, was a fairly notorious fire on an MSC ship in the middle of the Atlantic. The German registered vessel developed a fire in one of its holds, which very quickly spread, causing the crew to abandon ship around 1,000 miles from the nearest land, necessitating rescue by another ship on passage from Canada to the UK. One of the most extraordinary container ship fires in recent times is that of the Maersk Honum. The Maersk Honum caught alight in the Arabian Sea, Singapore registered vessel, a ULCC container carrier, so a fairly big ship, and she had a major fire forward of her accommodation. Now, the unfortunate thing about the Maersk Honum is that the fire very quickly reached the accommodation. This didn't just hamper the command and control aspects of the fire, but it also put a lot of the crew under a lot of duress as they tried to escape the smoke and flames. Now, the Maersk Honum had some pretty dodgy, dangerous cargo in the hold that was on fire, and as a result, the smoke from the fire was tainted with chlorine. The report on the Maersk Honum can be read, and when you look at the pictures, it's amazing to see that the light blue boiler suits that we associate with Maersk Line itself have been bleached white by the smoke as the crew members fled for their lives, with the fire spreading rapidly towards the accommodation. Ironically, the Express Pearl, another very, very intense container ship fire, also happened in the Arabian Sea and was also a Singapore registered vessel. Once again, the Express Pearl's fire spread rapidly throughout the entire vessel. The crew were evacuated from the ship, but very, very sadly, one crew member died on the Express Pearl. Unfortunately, on the Maersk Honum, 2 crew members also succumbed to their injuries, having been rescued. The MSC Flaminia and the explosion on it caused two crew members to be blown into the water. So each one of those ships that I've mentioned so far, the fire has caused loss of life. More recently, the Maersk Frankfurt, again in the Arabian Sea, a Panamanian registered vessel suffered a major fire on board. I'm sure a lot of you remember the So Long, which was involved in a collision with an anchored chemical tanker in the North Sea earlier this year. The fire raged quickly throughout that ship. Now, I know the fire on that container ship started very, very quickly because of the explosion and because of the flammable liquid that spilt from the tanker onto the deck of the container ship, but nonetheless the fire spread rapidly along the holds of the container ship all the way back to the accommodation. This most recent one, the Wanhai 53, which happened last week, again a Singapore registered vessel and again in the Arabian Sea. Now, this made me think, why are we having so many fires in the Arabian Sea? And what is it about that area that has created the conditions that make fires on container ships a lot more likely? Now, I did a bit of research into the Arabian Sea because my first thoughts were the temperature of the air in that area. And it's actually the sea temperature of the Arabian Sea that's making the news at the moment. In that, since 1982, some estimates have said that the average temperature of the Arabian Sea, so that's the sea in between India and the Middle East, part of the Indian Ocean, and as you transit from the Far East back to Europe via Suez, and we'll talk about the routes that don't go via Suez at the moment in a minute, but when you transit via Suez, basically it's the area between passing south of Sri Lanka and entering the Red Sea through what we used to call Hell's Gates because of the extreme temperatures at the bottom of the Red Sea, the Straits of Bab el-Mandab. So the little sea passage, I say little, the 4-day sea passage in between India and the Straits of Bab el-Mandab, that's the Arabian Sea. And there have been numerous studies on that sea conducted recently because the sea is suffering multiple marine heatwave days. Now, this is a new thing for me, and I didn't know what a marine heatwave was. Marine heatwaves are basically the water equivalent of a heatwave that we have when we have a period of warm weather, or hot weather, I should say, in a country. Now, a heatwave in the UK would generally mean that temperatures and air temperatures are above 30 degrees Celsius. And when this happens, we tend to blame it on the air mass that's coming to the United Kingdom. So normally we've got a tropical continental air mass being drawn up from most of the time North Africa, across the Western Europe and up to the United Kingdom. This combined with high pressure gives us lots of sunshine and gives us these very, very hot temperatures combined with very, very dry days. That tropical continental air is a very dry air. Now imagine that happening on the sea. Imagine on the sea that there is upwelling of very, very warm currents caused by global warming, but also caused by the natural effects of the circulation of the oceans. These warm currents well up through the various layers of the sea until they reach the surface. And when they reach the surface, this is known as a marine heatwave day. Now, the trouble with ships is that as they're going along, when these warm wellings happen, the ship is literally powering its way through very, very warm sea. And in the case of the Arabian Sea, sea that is 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than it was in 1982. It's almost boil in the bag. We are putting the ship into a very, very warm stretch of water, and the result of which is that the ship itself heats up, which means that the air in the holds heats up, which means that if any of the chemicals or flammable substances that are being transported get warmed up at the same time, this increases the likelihood of a fire starting. And whilst we need a source of ignition, that source of ignition can be provided quite simply by spontaneous combustion. It can be provided by something as innocent as an electrical switch clicking, which causes a spark. It can be something to do with the friction of the cargo inside the container, the cargo moving against the side of container. Anything can cause there to be an ignition, and with these volatile cargoes, as warm as they are, with the ship being heated up by the extremely warm water of the Arabian Sea, this all lends itself to the starting of a fire. But fire starting is a relatively frequent thing on a ship. I doubt there's many seafarers listening to this podcast who haven't at some point had experience of a fire on board the ship. So although container ship fires are frequent, and there was a study in 2023 that said there was actually one container fire every 9 days of 2023, which is an incredibly high frequency of container fires. So even though the frequency of fires is high, why are these fires not being controlled? What's the problem once the fire starts? Obviously, the fire not starting is where we really want to be. So we want to be in a position where the fire itself is controlled, the risk is controlled, and we don't have a fire in the first place. But when we do get these hot temperatures and fires do start, what is the problem? Why are crews not able to effectively fight the fire and contain the fire to stop it moving throughout the vessel, and more importantly, to stop it becoming a threat to life? As we said earlier on, several of the ships that I've mentioned have had casualties and fatalities involved with the fire. MSC Flaminia, the Maersk Honum, the Express Pearl, the Solong, the Wanhai 53, they have all had casualties associated with them. Multiple casualties in some cases. They are still trying to find 4 missing crew members from the Wanhai 53 from last week. They rescued 18 of the 22 crew, 4 are missing, and I suspect very sadly that those 4 seafarers won't be found until the conditions allow salvors to board the ship and do a proper search for the remains of those crew members, which, unless they've managed to jump over the side of the ship and there was an extensive search in the sea around the vessel, they may have succumbed to the fire itself. So, these are fatal fires. These are serious fires on deck. They cost life, they cost money, they ultimately are very capable of polluting the marine environment. So why can they not be controlled once they've started? We currently have a container ship in Southampton, which was initially detained by the MCA because it failed its drill. So it's a 300-metre Panamanian registered container ship, and the communication between the crew, in particular the communication from the command and control down to the fire parties, was so poor that when the MCA went on board to conduct port state, they conducted a drill, and as a result of this drill, the MCA detained the vessel. The drill was dangerously unsafe. The command team were unable to communicate with the rest of the crew, and therefore instructions to the fire parties were not given in a clear and concise way. The master's ability to manage the fire was not good, but the main problem with the drill was the communications between the bridge and the fire parties. This is something that is becoming more common on board container ships, and I see it quite often as a pilot. I will board the ship and I'll speak to the master. The master will be of a certain background and culture, and the helmsman may be a completely different nationality, a completely different culture, and sometimes when the two of them communicate, they struggle to find one another's understanding. The mixture of crews on container ships, as I see it as a pilot, is getting more and more diverse. And whilst there's nothing wrong with getting crews from more diverse areas of the world, ship managers need to ensure that there is no clash between the ability to communicate from Eastern European to Middle Eastern to European seafarers. English is normally the working language on most container vessels, and when you board as a pilot, you go up to the bridge, big sign on the bridge, the working language of the ship is English. Although that sign is there, you do hear particularly the officers and the masters conversing quite a lot in their native tongue, and you will also hear the ratings conversing in their native tongues. The communication between the officers and the ratings can always be a little bit strained. It can always be difficult for one nationality to understand the other nationality. And this becomes particularly important during stressful situations like an emergency, like a fire on a container inside a hold. Once the fire gets going, even if the fire is a small fire, there'll be a lot of smoke, a lot of anxiety kicking around the crew. And even if there was the ability to easily understand one another in less stressful conditions, once particularly command and control teams are put under a lot of duress, they can give instructions in a way which their own countrymen would easily understand, but their fellow crew members may struggle with. There are lots of different ways which humans react in emergencies, which is going to downgrade their ability to communicate. Cognitive overload is basically there's so much going on that we cannot process the facts in front of us. Our brains go into fight or flight mode, and this reduces the capacity to think logically, and along with that reduces the capacity for verbal articulation, which means that our ability to talk slowly and clearly, particularly to somebody else who doesn't speak the same language as us, deteriorates rapidly when we have cognitive overload during an emergency. This can further be exacerbated by tunnel vision, focusing on narrow threats, particularly threats to one's own life, which may mean that people ignore or misinterpret incoming information. If that incoming information is spoken by somebody with a different dialect in English to one that we are used to, then again it may become difficult for the crew to communicate with the command and control teams. Slurred or rapid speech, forgetfulness, confusion and contradictions can all add to the inability to effectively communicate in an emergency. And these are natural things that will happen when the body is put under the duress of even a modest fire. Seeing smoke pouring out of the hold from just a single small container fire is enough to trigger these reactions. Crew members will most likely expect the worst and hope for the best, and although the command team should do that in order to effectively fight the fire, expecting the worst and hoping for the best will affect the performance of those around you. Non-verbal signals may get distorted during an emergency, so body language becomes rigid or erratic, so the ability to communicate with hands, with your eyes, with your facial expressions becomes very, very difficult because you're afraid. Tones of voice may escalate and change because of the stress of the emergency. This can cause misinterpretation from crew members. Listening can be impaired. Obviously, stress itself reduces active listening, but there's a lot of noise that goes on in a fire. Fires are noisy things. Explosions may be happening. There may be air escaping from containers, all of which is creating noises which we're not used to. The other thing that sometimes shifts during an emergency is that the hierarchy and assertiveness may shift, and a master that was in command in less stressful situations may find themselves bending to the advice of more junior members of the crew, when they have started to feel the heat. So there are lots of reasons why crew communications can disintegrate in an emergency. However, we need to consider when manning our ship whether or not the mix of crew that we have decided to put on board will be able to deal with this stress, or is the level of communication on a normal day so low that once we start to do it under the duress of a fire, it becomes totally ineffective. It's not just about crew communications, drills as well. I hear from so many people when we talk about the frequency of drills on ships, and I might ask them a question as part of their oral prep. How often do you run a drill? And they start the sentence, well, you should do it every month. I say to them, why do you say you should do it every month? Oh, we rarely get time to do that. On our ship, it's normally about 6 weeks. And drills are really put right at the back of the ship's routine. Ships are busy. We know they're busy. Yep. We know that the modern shipping lines, modern shipping routes are busy routes. But nonetheless, particularly the masters of ships must make the most, and particularly of sea passages, to conduct drills to make sure that the crew are able to deal with various emergencies on board container ships, and in particular fires. So why do these ships that are coming from the Far East to Europe, why have they not had drills? Why have they not practiced dealing with these fires? Some of it may be down to the port state control setup in the Far East. A lot of Far East loops that come back to Europe spend 2 to 3 weeks going around the Far East coast. Now, if you have port congestion, that can increase to 5 or even 6 weeks. Ships can sometimes spend even 2 months going around their Far East ports before heading back towards Europe. Now, the reason for this is mainly because of the congestion that we seem to have at the moment, although it is easing in the Far East, but a lot because of literally the amount of ships and the amount of cargo that's being shipped around at the moment. So a ship that has spent a lot of time in the Far East may have spent a lot of time alongside in ports that may not have the same standard and level of port state control inspection that we see in European ports. This means that if the ship hasn't done a drill since it arrived in the Far East, it's unlikely to be picked up by any of the port state control officers that inspect out there, because the number of inspections and the way the data of the inspections is dealt with out in the Far East can fall a little bit short of what we try to implement here in Europe. The UK is part of the Paris Memorandum of Understanding, a group of countries that come together to share data on port state control, which includes the UK, Europe and Canada. We have the Tokyo MOU out there in the Far East, which includes Japan and many of the Far East countries. But the data sharing between countries out as part of the Tokyo MOU, not quite as effective as the data sharing here in Europe. And so port state control is not as effective out there as it could be. Ships can perhaps go 2-3 weeks without doing any drills whatsoever, and may even do the entire Far East coast without conducting a drill, meaning that unless they get that single drill in, once they get clear of the Singapore Straits, get out there into the Indian Ocean, get a bit of clear water around them, unless they really do make the most of that time, it may have been weeks since the crew were engaged in a drill. So here we are looking at 4 Arabian Sea container ship fires. We don't know when they last had a drill on board those ships. As I say, it could have been weeks beforehand. Oversight, however, doesn't just come from port state control. There should be oversight there from flag. There should be oversight from recognised organisations and classification societies. That oversight is essential when the ships are engaged on routes which are busy in areas where port state control may not be up to scratch. Ultimately, flag and the delegated surveys of flag to a recognised organisation, ultimately flag are responsible for ensuring that the ship is compliant with the legislation that flag has made for it. Flag are ultimately responsible for ensuring that the ship is doing what it must do legally. And therefore, if the master is not holding drills as often as legally required, then it's up to flag to pick up on that. Do they pick up on it? Do they not pick up on it? Sometimes flag push too much out to the recognised organisations, too much out to class. We understand why. Most flag states are fighting for resources with their relevant governments. But at the end of the day, the oversight of flag is the legal oversight that the United Nations Convention of the Sea requires the flag state to take the responsibility of ensuring compliance with the law. And if flag doesn't, then the recognised organisation should do so on its behalf, but without the ultimate flag oversight, ROs can start to cut corners as well. Also, during my research, misdeclared cargoes are becoming a huge problem on container ships. Now, again, this isn't necessarily about the control of the fire. It's more about the starting of the fire, and in particular, more about how to deal with the fire once it has started, knowing what volatile cargoes you have around it. A recent study saw that 8% of container cargoes were misdeclared as not being DGs when they were DGs, dangerous goods, or if they were declared as dangerous goods, were declared with the wrong UN number. In other words, the contents of the container, although declared as a dangerous good, the class was wrong, and therefore the hazards associated with that container was wrong. 8% is a huge number of containers with misdeclared dangerous goods inside them. When you consider the millions of containers that are transported every year by the container ships that run worldwide, 8% is a huge number to be high risk, because we don't really know what's inside them. Now, the trouble with this is that the cargoes that we are carrying inside these containers are becoming more and more volatile. So there are cargoes that are being identified by various organisations, but mainly by P&I clubs, cargoes that are being identified as being misdeclared because people aren't seeing the dangers within them. The Cargo Integrity Group of the International Cargo Handling Association has identified 15 cargoes of concern, 6 of which pose a massive threat when it comes to container fires. Now, those cargoes are charcoal, calcium hypochlorite, lithium ion batteries, there's our lithium batteries again, cotton and wool, fish meal and seed cakes. These are very, very common cargoes within containers, all of which are sometimes misdeclared, and all of which can cause container ship fires, particularly when they are stowed in holds when they should be stowed on deck. This takes us back to that very, very hot hold temperature as the ship proceeds down the incredibly warm Arabian Sea, with containers below in the very hot hold, which should be out there on deck, should be out in the fresh air getting cooling from the wind, and in the event of a fire should be on deck to enable the management of the fire to be easier by the ship's crew. But because they're misdeclared, a lot of these containers are being put deep down in the holds. They get hot, fires generate on board them, and they become incredibly difficult to fight because the container is buried amongst thousands of other containers in the bottom of the hold. Getting to it with firefighting, other than your main fixed firefighting system, is difficult, and a fixed firefighting system on a container ship although there, normally in the form of CO2, is a huge thing to activate. The holds must be completely sealed. There's massive amounts of CO2 you need to put in order to bring the carbon dioxide up to the level where it's going to extinguish the fire. 80 to 90% CO2 within a huge hold means there are huge batteries of CO2 to pump in there, and you've got to make sure the hold is properly sealed. Otherwise, this vast amount of CO2 is just going to escape and is going to become ineffective. Had these containers been on deck, they may be less likely to spontaneously combust under the heat of the hold, or if something does ignite them, then getting to them is easier, spotting where the fire is easier, dealing with the fire is easier. A lot of big new container ships have these huge fire monitors now positioned on the funnel, on the accommodation, that can blast vast amounts of water at a container fire on deck and cool it down rapidly. I mentioned our old faux lithium-ion batteries, and another bit in research that came out is because of the hugely increasing demand for electric cars, there's now a massive demand for used lithium-ion batteries. These used lithium-ion batteries are being transported via container for recycling, and this is a massively increasing cargo. Lithium-ion batteries and their thermal runaway, they add to the threat of fire on board container ships. And although a lithium-ion battery fire in a container may be a short-lived fire, as the batteries will eventually run out of energy and therefore run out of heat, by time that's happened, the heat has become so great that the fire has often spread to adjacent containers. And when those adjacent containers contain volatile goods, particularly those that have been misdeclared, then the combination is lethal. Once fire has started in a ship's hold, in a container ship hold, it is very difficult to bring it under control, particularly when you've got multiple containers containing dangerous goods. The fire will just move from one container to the other. Multiple containers containing used lithium-ion batteries. Again, the heat from the initial thermal runaway can trigger off thermal runaway on containers that are stowed nearby. So to summarize what we've been talking about during the podcast, we are seeing a massive increase in the severity of container ship fires. Over the last decade, there hasn't been a massive increase in the frequency of them, but the severity of them. And the severity of them has become higher because of various factors. The ability for the crew to communicate, the potential lack of oversight of ships when ships are trading in areas with little or no port state control, and the inability to identify volatile cargoes involved in a ship's emergency when a fire starts on a container ship. These are all contributing to the ferociousness and the extent of fires. Fires may be frequent on board some ships, they may be frequent on container ships, but if crew communications were better, if the dangerous cargoes were known, and if oversight from port state and recognised organisation improves, then perhaps the ability to control these fires will improve as well. We're never going to be able to turn down the heat in the Arabian Sea, and studies showed that it will continue to rise over the next decade to become one of the warmest, hottest seas in the world. Ships will always heat up when taking that route, and even going via the Cape of Good Hope doesn't really improve things from a risk point of view, because the African ports have little or no infrastructure to be able to bring ships in that are on fire. They don't have the facilities to be able to deal with a ship that pulls into port with a massive container fire on board. But ships transiting the Arabian Sea will be transiting ever increasing sea temperatures, and this can only highlight and exacerbate the risk associated with container ship fires by warming up a container ship's hold and making the atmosphere and the fire conditions inside it ripe for spontaneous combustion and ripe for combustion from container to container to happen, particularly if you've got DGs misdeclared and buried deep in the cargo holds. I hope that gives you all some food for thought as we move onwards and try to get to grips with some of these container ship fires. There are solutions being proposed by the IMO, solutions being proposed by P&I clubs and underwriters, including one that I saw which is very good, and that's smart containers. Smart containers have the ability to tell you when there's a fire in that particular container. They can have fixed firefighting systems built in. They can tell you the temperature, the contents of the container, tell you whether there's a fire there, and a smart container will be able to communicate with a central mainframe computer on board a ship and tell anybody wishing to interrogate that container what conditions are like on it. If a fire breaks out on the container, we don't just have the hold's fire alarm system going off saying there's a fire in a hold. We could have a smart container with a smart container telling the ship, I am in bay XYZ and I'm on fire, come and find me, I contain this material. I don't think that's particularly expensive, and when I was reading about smart containers, I really do think that could be the way forward for every container, particularly every container that carried a dangerous good, to have a built-in atmosphere monitoring system, the results of which can be transmitted wirelessly to the ship's computer and interrogated by the ship's officers. That's one solution currently being touted around. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening to this podcast. My name is Barry Sadler, and I look forward to welcoming you once again to my next podcast. In the meantime, guys, do have a great day.